Okay, now we're ready to launch on that much vaunted exploration of the biology of hope. And we're going to begin that in this module and in 4 subsequent modules. This one is divided for your convenience into 4 parts. We will begin with another discussion of where exactly hope might be considered to reside in the human body. Then we'll go on to talk for a few minutes about some experiments conducted by Bruce Cohen at Harvard University to explore the neurochemical basis for hope. And that will beget a really interesting discussion of this thing called placebos. You think you know what that is, but you don't. It turns out it has a fairly ancient history and has extended forward into the present. So we'll go over that and then conclude with a discussion of the use of placebos in modern medicine, particularly in the area of pain research. So, if you were asked to identify the place in the human body where hope resides, what would you say? I'm asking you. You don't have to send me an email, but it would be nice if you thought about it for a second or two and then decided for yourself where you think this thing called hope resides in the human body. If we ask other people who, for one reason or another, have sought to give some advice on this particular question, we might start with Václav Havel, who is the past president of the Czech Republic. It was a war-torn country, formerly Czechoslovakia, and it broke off with Slovakia at one point in its relatively recent history, and that begat a whole bunch of unpleasant things. And Václav Havel, having endured those things and then becoming the president of the new Czech Republic, has some perhaps well-informed insight on the matter. And so let's look at what he said. He wrote a lovely poem entitled, appropriately, Hope. Either we have hope, or we don't. It, meaning hope, is a dimension of the soul, and it is not particularly dependent on some observation of the world. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world and is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond the horizons. Okay, so let's stop there for a moment. So Havel has identified hope as existing in 3 different places: in the soul, in the spirit, and in the heart, all ostensibly parts of the human body. And yet he concludes that it transcends this world. It really isn't a corporeal thing. It's something else. So continuing on, hope is the deep and powerful sense. It is not the same as joy in that things are going well. So as an aside, Havel would then agree with Lionel Tiger, who distinguished between optimism, the naive faith that everything is going to work out fine because it has to, and hope, that enduring thing that serves you even in times of great misery and trial. But getting back to Havel, hope is the deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy and things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands to succeed. Hope is definitely not the same as optimism. So there we have a very explicit agreement with Lionel Tiger. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well. Again, referencing Tiger. But hope is the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It is hope, above all, which gives us strength to live and continually try new things. So, a lovely statement of hope as belonging to a transcendent spirit world, a thing that takes up residence in the soul and also in the heart, and yet really is not part of this world, but nonetheless is the basis for our ability to move through triumph and tragedy alike and come out on the other end whole. That's what Havel said. But let's move on to some things that scientists have said. I did not identify Havel as a scientist, although he has some inclinations in that direction, but he's not really a practicing scientist, as the other people I'm going to mention are. So if we start with Dr. Jerry Groupman, he is a very famous neurobiologist, and he spent his career treating some very ill people, often at the end of their lives. And what he said, he in fact wrote a book entitled Anatomy of Hope, so he's very invested in the idea of hope, and he certainly has seen hope and its lack in the patients that he's treated. Jerome Groupman, I call him Jerry. Hope, I have come to believe, is as vital to our lives as the very oxygen we breathe. Okay, so Jerry Groupman, is a scientist, he's a physician, he has intimate knowledge of neurobiology, and he is saying to us that, this thing called hope, however you want to define it, it's so important to us that without it, we would literally die, because it is as important as that oxygen that sustains every breath that we breathe. Despite Groupman's, I would call, enlightened perspective on hope, a more typical statement about hope coming from scientists might be the one that follows. In other words, quote, hope causes physical changes, as an aside, in the human body, but much of the evidence for it is anecdotal. So that person was not identified, but he is pretty much a typical scientist. Scientists would probably agree with Groupman that hope is a nice thing to have, but they would not go on to also argue, particularly, that hope is responsible for positive outcomes in medicine. It might be the case, but I would think they would argue that there just isn't a rigorous body of data to back it up. But if there is a legitimate biology of hope, something that has province in the science of biology, we ought to be able to formulate some testable hypotheses if it is a real scientific question. And here are some that we might want to consider if hope is indeed a thing of science and a thing of biology. We might ask, for instance, how far is the reach of hope? Hope might be able to turn a bad day into a good one, but can it really cure dread disease? Certainly, some people would suggest that, but what is the evidence for it? What are its limits? Are there certain diseases that simply can't touch because they're too bad, or that hope cannot be summoned in sufficient amounts to make a difference? What are its limits? What, if any, are the data that support the alleged biological basis for hope, the one that I've been arguing for now for, what is this, lecture 7 or 8? And for throughout those lectures, I've been arguing that, yes, there is a legitimate biological basis for this thing we call hope. So at this point, we need to start considering what are the hurdles to adopting the full-fledged notion that hope is part and parcel of biology in the same way that other emotions, such as fear and anger, are considered to be a legitimate biological phenomenon. Perhaps it's fair to say that the reigning view, the skeptical view about hope particularly in medicine, is that it's a nice thing to have. It might make you feel momentarily better, but in the end, it's basically just wishful thinking. And it's wishful thinking without any demonstrable medical benefit. So that is kind of the reigning prejudice among scientists. There are certainly a lot of fantastic claims made about hope, similar to those kinds of claims that are made about homeopathic medicine and other non-traditional approaches to medicine. But we need to ask about all of this stuff. Western medicine is one approach. It's very interventionist in nature, but sometimes things go better if you kind of let the body alone to heal, or you evoke a sympathetic chord in the brain that promotes healing. That's certainly an approach. We need to ask whether this is all just kind of wishful thinking that's devoid of any long-term physical reality, or whether there is indeed some substance to the notion that a hopeful attitude can promote a good outcome. Obviously, we're concerned particularly with medicine, but we could also put this question into realms that have nothing to do with medicine specifically, but have to do with the well-being of a person in his life. So we want to know if any of this is true. Is hope simply a fantasy or something that we can talk about but can't really alter your physiology in such a way that leads to better health or a more salutary outcome? We do know there is a school of thought that the mind itself, this thing that we call a mind, which is another word that's difficult to define in biology, whatever it is, the mind is legitimately thought to be a part of the brain. We also have a broadening view that the brain and the body are joined through neurons. This is demonstrable every time you dissect a human and look at the brain and the body that it resides in. You will notice that there are many, 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 many neuronal connections between those two entities. And we also know, and you also know, that one of the things that the brain is doing for the rest of the body through its neurons is sending neurohormones and neurotransmitters to help those neurons communicate with each other and help organs like glands and other organs respond to the stuff the brain is doing. But Western medicine, traditional medicine in our view, still likes to separate the body and the mind, in part because we're not really sure what the mind is. But we do think, because neurobiology is a real thing, that those two are joined in some way, even if that way cannot be tapped into as a reservoir for medicinal healing. On the other hand, there is a well-developed literature dealing with things like the biology of fear, the biology of anger, the biology of other emotions, let's say jealousy or love. All of those things are pretty much thought to be the realm of biology, and that's why we can have fMRI scans of brains demonstrating things like fear or anger or love. At least we're on the trail of this phenomenon to that extent. So let's at least say that there's some likelihood that there is a real biology of hope and that it has a basis in the neurons and neurotransmitters. If we can agree on that much, it'll be much easier to proceed. Now, kind of an early adopter, other than Dr. Grootman, of the notion that hope, this nebulous thing that's hard to define, hope has a role in curing the body when the body is having problems. And this is the notion advanced by Dr. Bruce Cohen, who is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And he believes very firmly that the mind and the body share importance in determining the outcome and the course of disease. Now, his particular interest is studying the biological basis of drug dependency. He, like many, many others, have determined that once you're addicted to a drug, once it's a habit that your body relies on, it's very difficult to break the habit and separate yourself from those drugs. And that's one of the reasons why recidivism rates of people who have been addicted to drugs and go through various interventions nonetheless have lots of trouble staying off drugs once they've gone through these kinds of interventions and therapies. So recognizing that staying off drugs, even if you want to, is difficult, Bruce Cohen is now looking at hope as a catalyst both for getting off and staying off addictive drugs. That's what his clinical practice is all about. He's asking some really interesting questions, such as, where is hope formed in the mind? Again, hope is in the body somewhere. Could be the mind, could be the heart, could be the spirit, could be the soul. We're not really entirely sure, nor can we define things like spirit and soul very scientifically. But Cohen thinks it's there, it's in the mind. And as such, because the mind is in the brain somewhere, we should be talking about neurons and neurotransmitters. That's kind of the attitude that he takes towards this. And one hypothesis that he's advancing and is studying in his research is how and whether hope might affect the neurochemistry of the brain and the body in such a way that it changes the physiology of that body and makes it possible to overcome these impediments to getting off and staying off drugs. So these are all measurable proposals and testable hypotheses. So Cohen is going where we collectively want to go. He's done a lot of work using brain scanners, as others have, but in particular, his lab charts brain circuits. He's looking at neurotransmitters in those neurocircuits. He's examining what happens to their connections in terms of motivation and setting goals, seeking rewards, and in particular, sustaining desirable behaviors, particularly in opposition to those behaviors that are addictive in nature and seek drugs. So he's looking for the neuronal basis for setting goals, for securing the motivation needed to stay off goals, and combating the competing desire to continue to engage in addictive drug behavior. Ultimately, his real goal, of course, is to help people stay off drugs, which is a wonderful thing. And he, at least, is of the view that this ability to overcome addictive behavior and the desire to go back to those behaviors, he believes that it is intimately connected to hope and a person's ability to sustain that hope. So we now have two physicians, Jeremy Groopman and Bruce Cohen, proposing a place for hope in medical treatment. Now, it's not the reigning view. Most physicians would agree that hope is a useful thing. It's better to be hopeful than not. But most physicians aren't yet ready to go to the place where we say hope is a thing that's essential to a good outcome in medical treatment. And as I mentioned, Bruce Cohen is, at this point, going about the business of collecting data to demonstrate, we hope conclusively, that there is a neuronal basis for the experience of hope. But this then requires us to take a bit of a side trip and look at this thing called the placebo effect. And we want to start with a discussion that goes back several hundred years, interestingly enough. If we take this task on and do it thoroughly, the first place we want to go to talk about the biology of hope and its relationship to this thing called placebo is, back in medieval times. The word placebo comes from the Latin placere, and the particular derivative placebo in Latin means I shall please. It's the future indicative form of placere. As an aside, also, the Latin verb placere, meaning to please, is related to another similar sounding word, placare, which means to pacify. And as we go through this material, you'll see that placere and placare often are intertwined in the material that we look at. So we go back to the 8th century and discover that the Catholic Church, which has procedures for codifying every important rite and ritual in the lives of regular humans, not surprisingly, one of the important rituals that gets covered in the Catholic Church in a fairly ritualistic and very regimented way is what happens when people die. There's a Catholic ritual for honoring the dead that's described and laid out in a Vespers service, which has an interesting and convoluted and complicated structure. In the Vespers for the dead, one part of the structure that is required for the priests to perform is called the antiphon, which is a devotional song that would be sung by the priest during the Vespers for the dead. And this is followed by a psalm, which is done in a call and response format so the audience gets to participate. And the first antiphon begins with the phrase, Placebo Domine Regione Vivorum, which means, in translation, I shall please, placebo, I shall please the Lord in the land of the living. So placebo shows up in the Vespers for the dead as a pronouncement by the priest, placebo, I shall please God in the land of the living. So that's where we see it first, but placebo evolves over several centuries, and the first note of evolution occurs during medieval times. As you know, funeral masses were held to honor the dead, and families that could afford it began to pay mourners to show up at these funerals and to perform. What did they do in the way of performance? Well, basically there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. So the mourners were paid to mourn, and this was occasioned through lots of sounds of anguish and being upset, which was translated into wailing sounds and pounding of chest and that sort of thing. The purpose of doing this was probably twofold. One, since mostly well-to-do people were able to pay mourners, one was to demonstrate that this was a person of consequence who could turn out a bunch of people to mourn his death. The other purpose of paying mourners to perform at funerals was to pacify the grieving mourners. If you are all joined in this event of mourning, it has a pacifying effect on those who are bereaved. And that's why people did it. But it also grew in popularity among those who could afford it for the following reason. Imagine you're there in medieval times. Times were hard. To convince yourself of this, go back and read any piece of literature from medieval times, and you'll see that people were poor. There were people who were well off, but most people lived in, huts with dirt floors. They had very little food. The food they had was uncertain. Life was hard. And so when somebody died and families of deceased held a funeral, one of the very common things to do, particularly among the well-to-do, was to have a funeral dinner of some sort. And they would also distribute various forms of largesse to the congregation, little pieces of swag. I don't know what was popular in medieval times as swag, but something that everybody thought was a cool thing. And so between the food and the swag, it became, when a funeral was announced, it became very common for people who didn't even know the deceased to show up and to take part in the meal that was offered to mourners, and also to walk away with some of the cool free stuff that might have been given out as swag. And this practice of parasitizing the funeral meal became so common that people figured out that a lot of the folks who were there didn't have any knowledge of this person whatsoever, but they were simply there to participate in the goodies that were handed out. And so at that point, their grief was recognized for what it was, namely fake, simply a means to an end of getting a free meal. And the people who did this were then known as so-called grief simulators, who sort of chanted insincerely placebo domino regione vivorum, simply as a way to cement their access to food, wine, and free gifts. Oops. Let's go. So, placebo, at that point, started to become associated with a falsehood, a fake. And as time went on, the connection became explicit. Placebo was now understood as connoting a freeloader. And this then begins to appear in literature of the time. A great example is The Parson's Tale by Geoffrey Chaucer. In it, he has a character whose name is actually Placebo. At this point, placebo means fake or a freeloader. The character in question, Placebo, was the ultimate yes man, a person who distinguished himself by currying favor through excessive flattery to those above him so that he could have means so that he could talk them out of their wine and their food. So placebo, at this point, morphs into the notion of sycophant, somebody who kisses up to the people above him just to get good stuff. And it was commonly understood by this time that the emotions being evoked by the people singing placebo were not real. They were fakes. And this goes on for quite a long time, but even as recently as the 1970s, the notion of placebo and fake grief was taken to its perhaps logical extreme when a journalist in the UK deliberately decided to test the hypothesis that she could attract a huge audience to do this fake placebo thing by publishing a death notice of a perfectly fictitious person. The person did not exist, but a death notice with the relevant biographical fake information was published in a newspaper in London. And in it, it gave the date, location of the funeral, and announced that a dinner and party with lots of food and drink would follow. And as a consequence, hundreds of people showed up in relatively modern times to mourn a person who did not exist, to get the good food, drink, and swag. So, it's a real thing among people. But there's one other way in which placebos morphed during this time that I want to talk about now, because it's very relevant to the question of hope in medicine. If we go back a couple of centuries to 1785, placebo, having acquired the connotation of something that was fake, was given a role in medicine. A placebo in medicine was something whose function was not to cure a medical problem, but rather to pacify a demanding patient. So here again is that connection between placere, to please, and placare, to pacify. So you know what it's like. Maybe you've done it yourself, or maybe a parent has done it on your behalf. Let's say you're a child and you have a fever that won't go away, or a cough that won't go away, or a sore throat that won't go away, and so you report to the doctor and you try a few things that's not working. The doctor, even in modern times, might be driven, particularly if your parent complains a lot, to provide you with a fake medicine, one that has no biological activity to help your disease, but perhaps will trip whatever is going on in the mind to help a placebo effect emerge, and also to get the complaining parent off the physician's case. And so as time went on, it became fairly routine to have, sugar pills sitting around in the physician's office that he could put in an official-looking white envelope and hand to a demanding patient as a placebo, a fake medicine, to take to maybe get him out of the doctor's office and stop having him, the complaining patient, take up the physician's time. So placebos took on a life as a fake medicine designed to pacify a patient and get him out of the doctor's office. But in the 1950s, placebos graduated from being a possibly helpful counterfeit medicine to constituting a vital part of modern medicine. And this happened with the introduction of formal clinical trials. It used to be the case that the way drugs got to market could be fairly haphazard, but by the 1950s, we realized that you really had to take a very rigorous look at the effectiveness of things before you started prescribing them as treatments. And during this time, the idea of having two treatment groups, one of which got the actual drug that you hoped would help alleviate the condition, and the other of which got a placebo, emerged. And the idea was to compare the results in the group getting the actual drug, and compare it to what happened to the folks getting the fake placebo. We developed this as a double-blind study. In every case, we had two treatment groups, but the patients did not know which pill they were getting. So this should have been a good way to discern a placebo effect from an actual therapeutic benefit. The placebos, in essence, served as controls for meaningless variation in normal physiology that occurs in any study. It also helped establish the 0 point, or the baseline, from which the actual effect with the real medicine took place. In the double-blind studies that were done, and as part of their rationale, the physicians also did not know which patients got the actual drug and which patients got the placebo, and that's why we call them double-blind. Neither the patient nor the physician knew who got which treatment. And then a funny thing happened in these standardized double-blind studies. Over time, there were a number of cases in which it appeared that the placebos actually had a benefit similar to the drug being tested. And it is in this realm where the idea of hope as a medical phenomenon enters the discussion. With all controlled experiments, the actual testable hypothesis when we have such experiments where we have based the experiments on testable hypotheses, one of the most common ways in which a placebo effect in which the placebo, like the treatment, has a salutary effect on the medical condition under treatment, has occurred when we were trying to control pain. And so in these studies, what would happen is you would have two groups. One was the actual treatment group, and those folks would get the actual medication designed to control pain, and they would be then compared to the placebo group, who were given not the drug designed to control pain, but a placebo that should have no effect. But time and again, when you looked at what was going on in those two groups, the placebo people were doing maybe not as well, but pretty well. The placebo was not having no effect. The folks getting the placebos were having some of their pain controlled. And this happened so many times that people began to realize, you know what, there might be something to the idea of a placebo effect. As I mentioned, the place where this became evident time and again were situations in which we were trying to control pain, often with new drugs, and we wanted to compare the new drugs against placebos to establish the baseline data that I mentioned earlier and the fact that the pain medication really worked. And at this point, we need to do a little bit of an explanation about how pain is realized in the nervous system and how we can potentially control pain. Pain is due to specific neurons acting to communicate a message of pain from some sensory organ, let's say nerves in your fingers if you're touching a hot stove. The sensory neurons in your finger pick up a message, the stove is hot, and they send it to your spinal cord. And when the message gets to your spinal cord, the pain message is transferred up the spine into your brain, where it says, "Whoa, hot! Move your fingers!" So the brain has assessed the information, it has made a decision, and now it's going to send a message back down the spine and out to the muscles in your fingers, telling you to get your hand away from the stove. So, the important part of this equation is that the pain signal in two instances either moves up the spine to the brain or from the brain down the spine to the muscle, which is going to allow you to take action to get away from the pain. And hopefully you realize from this discussion that the brain is where the consciousness of that pain is perceived. Okay? The signal has to go up the spine to the brain assesses the situation and then formulates a response, which is then communicated to the muscles that will help enact the plan to fix the problem. So the brain is the guru in all of this. Now, let me give you a few more details about what happens to the pain signal as the pain signal is moving up the spine towards the brain. Because there are cells within the spine that can alter or modulate the pain signal as it's going up the spinal cord. And there are two possibilities here. The one is that the pain signal will encounter what we call an on cell in the spinal cord, and this cell has the impact of increasing the sensation of pain when the signal gets to the brain. In fact, the on cells can tell you to withdraw your hand from a hot stove before your brain is technically aware of that pain. And if you think about it, it's a really good thing to do because you don't want to wait that extra millisecond for the signal to get to your brain and your brain to say, oops, hot stuff. It would be better for you as a whole person to know or have the action of moving away from the cells, away from the source of the heat before the signal gets to the brain for processing. And this is what the on cells do. They increase the sensation of pain, causing you to withdraw faster than you otherwise might. The other possibility is for the pain signal to connect with an off cell. The off cells have the effect of acting like circuit breakers, so they cut down the pain signal in mid-reaction. It's the pain signal's headed to the brain for processing, but the off cells, if they intercept it, can act like circuit breakers and prevent the pain signal from getting to the brain at all. As an aside, there are genetic conditions in which you have too many off cells in your nervous system, particularly in your spine, and while it's a nice thing in the sense that you are less likely to feel pain, it can be a bad thing in the sense that you may not feel pain when it's good for you to feel pain because it prevents you from entering into some activity that is bad for you, like the hot stove. If you don't feel the hot stove, you won't take your hand away and your fingers will fry. Not good. So people who have this particular condition may act like they're impervious to pain, and in a sense they are, but they're not impervious to the bad things that the pain is masking, or that the off cells are masking, and as a result, it can be overall a bad thing to have no sensation of pain in your nervous system. So, for this reason, you have, or the normal person has, way more on cells than you have off cells, so that you can do things that will benefit you, like getting away from a hot stove. Now, your brain works with various endogenous chemicals, some of which have opiate-like activity. And one of the drugs that the human brain, because of our own endogenous opiate drugs, one of the drugs that the human brain is designed to respond to are things like morphine. This is not produced by the human brain, but you can take it as a drug, and it will block the sensation of pain. And we know how morphine works because we've studied it for decades. Basically, morphine puts up roadblocks in the CNS to stop the pain signal from getting to the brain. And it does this specifically by binding to and shutting down the on cells. So remember, you've got those on cells in your spine. If they receive a pain signal, it ramps up the sensation of pain so that you withdraw your hand from the hot stove as quickly as possible. Well, in the presence of morphine, and obviously we wouldn't use morphine to allow you to burn your fingers on a stove, but morphine is given for other pain-relieving circumstances. And we know that it works by binding to the on cells in your spine. And this then, when the on cells are bound to morphine, they're functionally not operating, and this allows the off cells in your spine to block the pain signal, to have the circuit breaker effect that I mentioned earlier. So it's really useful if you've had surgery or something, and oftentimes if you've had a fairly significant surgery, they will set you up with your own morphine pump, and you can self-administer the morphine when the pain gets really bad. And what the morphine is doing is binding to the on cells, allowing the off cells to remain active and to have their circuit breaker effect. Now, if you do this, if you're in the hospital having morphine treatment because you're in significant pain, you might start to feel a sort of feeling of bliss, thinking that, the world's a great place, nothing can hurt me. And it's indication of a morphine high, and the problem is that sometimes when you get off the morphine, because the pain should have gone to a place where it's pretty manageable, you still want to get that feeling of invincibility and being high on morphine, and then you start taking morphine outside of the hospital setting, or you get into some of the other kinds of prescription drugs that do roughly the same thing, and now you're addicted, and that's a problem. So this is not something you should do in an unregulated way, but there are specific cases where this is an intervention that is good for you and something that the official medical folks will endorse because it really is a life-sustaining function. Now, how does this relate to hope? Well, we need to talk about some actual experiments. It turns out, I mentioned earlier, we have not morphine, but natural opiates in our brains. We have specific names for these materials. They're called endorphins and enkephalins. And they are released by your body, by your brain, under various circumstances. One, we think, is if you are a runner and you run a lot, you release endorphins as you run, and that may make the work of running and the pain endured in long-distance running less of a problem. Plus, you have the I feel good sensation, and I'm invincible, and life is great attitude that comes from having the on cells blocked and the off cells doing their circuit breaker thing. So you've got your own internal opiates that you use physiologically, and it turns out that in addition to the runner's high and other uses, the belief that you are not going to feel pain and the expectation that you will not have pain, in other words, two ingredients of hope, may be sufficient from preventing you from feeling pain, even if you do not receive morphine to control your pain. So this is basically what's going on in the experiments that we're going to look at in some detail. These are experiments that were conducted by Fabrizio Benedetti, who is at the University of Turin, and we'll take those up in the next module. Here is your study guide.